My name is Josie Calder. I'm 34 years old. I've spent the last 9 years as a large animal veterinarian across 3 counties of high desert ranch country, which means I've learned exactly one thing that matters more than almost anything else in an emergency. When something's spooked and dangerous, you do not raise your voice. You go still. You let the room settle around you before you move. That instinct is the only reason I didn't say a single word when my stepbrother Boone stood up at the kitchen table in the house I grew up in, pointed a finger at me, and said, "This is Calderland. Runs in Calder blood. Doesn't matter how many years you've clocked out here, Josie. It was never going to be yours." My stepsister Dahlia nodded beside him, arms crossed, the same posture she'd held toward me at every family gathering for 24 years. Nobody at that table. Not Boone, not Dahlia, not even, I think, some quiet part of myself that had spent 9 years choosing not to think about it directly. Knew that the ranch they were discussing selling out from under all of us had my name recorded on the deed at the county courthouse. Not someday. Not eventually. Already. For 9 years. If you've ever been told, explicitly or in 1,000 smaller ways, that you weren't really family, stay with me to the end, because this one has a piece of paper in it that's going to change how this entire story gets remembered. Subscribe and drop the word bloodline in the comments right now, before we even begin. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need the whole shape of this ranch and this family to understand exactly what that kitchen table conversation actually cost Boone and Dahlia and exactly what it protected. The Calder Ranch sits on 1,100 acres of high desert range outside a town in Wyoming, small enough that the post office and the feed store share a parking lot. Gene Calder's great-grandfather homesteaded the original parcel in 1911, and every generation since had added to it, patched it back together after hard winters, held onto it through droughts that pushed half the neighboring ranches into subdivision and second home development. 5 generations of Calderland was a phrase I heard so often growing up that it eventually stopped registering as a sentence and started functioning more like a heartbeat, a rhythm underneath every conversation in that house, whether the conversation was actually about the ranch or not. My mother married Jean when I was 10. She'd been widowed young. My biological father died in a highway accident when I was 6. And she met Jean at a county fair 2 years later through a mutual friend who ran the 4-H program. Gene was, in every way that mattered to me as a child, a genuinely good man. Steady, quiet, the kind of person who noticed when a fence post was leaning before it actually fell and fixed it before anyone else even registered the problem existed. He never once, in 24 years, treated me as anything less than his own daughter in the ways that were within his direct control. He taught me to ride, taught me to read weather, sat up with me the night a mare I loved foaled badly and nearly didn't make it. I called him Dad by the time I was 12, and he never once corrected me. His 2 biological children, Boone and Dahlia, were 14 and 12 when my mother and I moved into the ranch house. And from almost the first week, there was a specific, consistent current running underneath every interaction we had. Not cruelty, not in any dramatic, nameable way, but a quiet, persistent reminder, delivered in dozens of small phrasings over the years, that I was a guest in a story that had already been written before I arrived. Boone used to introduce me to his friends as my dad's wife's kid, a phrase technically accurate, and I came to understand over time, deliberately withholding. Dahlia, gentler in delivery but no less consistent in substance, would talk about Calder family tradition in a way that always seemed to quietly exclude me from the pronoun, even as I stood right there, having spent that same morning helping move cattle through the same gates her own great-grandfather built. I want to be fair to both of them, the way I've tried to be fair through every part of this story. I don't think either Boone or Dahlia ever consciously decided to make me feel like an outsider. I think it was simply the water they'd been raised in. A family identity built entirely around bloodline and inheritance, in a place where land had been handed down through direct lineage for 100 years, and neither of them had ever had reason to examine what that framework quietly did to someone standing just outside it. 9 years ago, when I was 25, 3 years into my veterinary practice and still paying down student loans that felt, some months, like they'd outlive me, the ranch came close to failing in a way it never fully had, even through the hardest winters of Gene's own father's generation. It was a compounding disaster, the way these things usually are. 2 consecutive years of drought that gutted the hay yields, a collapse in cattle prices the same season Gene had expanded the herd based on the previous year's stronger numbers, and a balloon payment on a land improvement loan he'd taken out to drill a second well, coming due at the exact moment his income had cratered. I learned about the severity of it almost by accident, the way I've learned about most of the important, buried things in this story. Not because anyone told me directly, but because I noticed something wrong and refused to look away from it once I had. Gene had always been meticulous about the ranch's books, but during a visit that spring, I found a stack of certified letters on his desk, the kind that arrive when a lender has stopped sending gentler reminders. I asked him directly. He didn't want to tell me at first. Some of the same pride, I think, that ran through Boone and Dahlia, just channeled differently in him, into stoicism instead of exclusion. But eventually he laid it out. He was 90 days from a foreclosure notice on the second mortgage. $340,000, the full balance of the improvement loan plus penalties, needed within 60 days, or the bank would begin proceedings against the entire property. Not just the newer parcel the well loan covered, but the whole ranch, cross-collateralized the way rural agricultural loans often are. I asked him if Boone or Dahlia knew. He said no. Boone was living 4 states away, working in commercial trucking, with debts and a divorce of his own that meant he had nothing to offer. Dahlia was closer, married with 2 young kids, stretched thin on a single income after her husband's construction business slowed. Gene said, quietly, looking out at the range through his office window, "I don't want either of them carrying this. It's not theirs to carry. It's mine, and I built it, and I'll figure it out." I had, by that point, built a reasonably successful practice and had savings I'd been slowly accumulating, partly toward a future clinic expansion, partly just out of the careful habit of a person who'd grown up watching a family nearly lose everything to a single hard season. I want to be honest about the decision I made, because I've turned it over in my mind many times since. I didn't offer the money as an investment. I didn't do it expecting anything back. I offered it because I loved this land, and I loved the man who'd raised me on it, and I could not watch him lose either one while I had the means to prevent it. I paid the full $340,000 directly to the lender, retiring the loan entirely. Gene fought me on it, hard, for almost a week, in the specific stubborn way of a man who'd spent his whole life being the one who solved problems rather than the one who received solving. He only agreed, finally, on one condition of his own, not mine. He insisted on having his attorney draft a deed amendment, adding my name as a joint owner of the property, with full rights of survivorship. I told him I hadn't done it for that. He told me, in words I still remember precisely, "I know you didn't. That's exactly why I'm doing it. I'm not going to let you save this place and then stand here pretending you don't have a real stake in it. That's not fairness. That's just me being too proud to say thank you properly." We recorded the deed amendment at the county courthouse that same month. Neither of us told Boone or Dahlia. I didn't push for that silence. I want to be honest that if it had been fully up to me, I might have handled it differently. But Gene asked me to let him choose the timing, and I respected that, the same way I'd always respected the quiet, careful way he moved through difficult things. He said he didn't want it framed, in that moment, as a story about who deserved the ranch more. He wanted it framed, eventually, on his own terms, as a story about who'd actually shown up. That timing never came, because 8 months ago, Gene had a stroke, severe enough that he's been in a long-term care facility since, unable to speak clearly, though present, aware, and, on his good days, able to communicate in slow, deliberate fragments that still, unmistakably, sound like him. I want to walk you through the shape of those 9 years, because they matter as much as the deed itself. I never once, in 9 years, treated my ownership stake as anything beyond a private arrangement between Gene and me. I didn't take on decision-making authority I hadn't earned through actual work. I still showed up, the way I always had, to help during calving season, to cover veterinary care for the herd at cost, to sit with Gene on slow Sunday afternoons the way I had since I was 10 years old. Boone and Dahlia's relationship to the ranch, and to me, continued largely as it always had. Occasional visits, holiday gatherings, the same low, persistent current of not quite family running underneath most of our interactions, now simply layered over 9 years of a fact neither of them knew existed. I watched, during those years, as Boone's financial situation never fully stabilized, And as Dahlia's family struggled through a rough stretch after her husband's business finally folded entirely, Jean helped both of them when he could, out of the ranch's modest ongoing income. Nothing dramatic, a few $1,000s here or there, the kind of quiet parental support that doesn't get discussed openly but that everyone in a family generally senses is happening. I never once resented it. I want to be clear about that. I never felt entitled to a larger share of anything because of what I'd contributed financially. I'd made my choice 9 years earlier with my eyes open, and I meant every part of it. What I didn't fully anticipate, what none of us, I think, fully anticipated, was what would happen once Gene's stroke took the ranch's actual day-to-day authority out of his hands entirely and left 3 adult children, only one of whom knew the ranch's true legal structure, to figure out what came next. 8 months after Gene's stroke, with his care costs mounting and no clear plan in place, Boone flew back from out of state and called a family meeting at the ranch house. The same kitchen where I'd eaten probably 4,000 meals across 24 years. The same table where Gene used to spread out the ranch's books every February to plan the coming season. Boone had, it turned out, already been in contact with a development group interested in the property. Not for continued ranching, but for a mix of large residential parcels, the kind of development quietly transforming ranch land across half the West as agricultural economics get harder and land values climb. He'd gotten a preliminary offer, informal but real, $4.2 million for the full 1,100 acres. "I know this is hard," Boone said, sliding a folder across the table. The same gesture. I noted distantly that so many hard family conversations in this genre of story seem to involve, though I didn't know that yet, not being someone who watched this kind of content. But Dad's care isn't cheap, and none of us are ranchers in any real sense anymore. This is Calder land. It's ours to decide what happens to it now. Dahlia nodded, quieter than Boone but clearly aligned. "It's not about not caring," she said. "It's about being realistic. None of us can run this place." And honestly, Josie, she looked at me for the first time directly. "I know you've always loved it out here, but this isn't really your decision to weigh in on. This is Calder blood, Calder legacy. We appreciate everything you've done for Dad over the years, but this one's ours to figure out." Boone nodded, more bluntly. "This is Calder land, runs in Calder blood. Doesn't matter how many years you've clocked out here, Josie. It was never going to be yours." I felt the whole room's attention settle on me, waiting for whatever reaction they expected. Hurt, maybe, or a quiet, gracious retreat, the shape of response I think both of them had unconsciously assumed I'd default to, given 24 years of exactly that pattern. I did the thing I do with a spooked animal in the field. I didn't move fast. I didn't raise my voice. I let the room settle, silently, around the sentence Boone had just said, and I checked it twice in my own mind before I responded, the way I check a diagnosis before I commit to it out loud. "I understand this is a hard decision," I said, evenly. "But before you go any further with that offer, there's something you both need to know, and I think it should come from me directly rather than from a lawyer's letter. Comment the word bloodline right now if you've ever had someone confidently tell you something wasn't yours, in a room where you already knew, quietly, that it was. Because that's the exact moment this story turns." I told them plainly, without embellishment, without any performance of vindication, exactly what had happened 9 years earlier. The letters on Gene's desk. The $340,000. The deed amendment, recorded at the county courthouse, that made me a joint owner of the property with full rights of survivorship, meaning, functionally, that no sale of any portion of this ranch could legally proceed without my consent. Boone's expression moved through several stages in the span of maybe 10 seconds. Confusion first, then something sharper, disbelief edging toward anger. "That's not possible," he said. "Dad would have told us." "He wanted to," I said. "He told me himself he intended to, eventually, on his own terms. I think the stroke took that choice away from him before he got to make it the way he wanted to. I'm not telling you this to hurt either of you. I'm telling you because you're about to make a $4 million decision based on information that isn't accurate, and I couldn't let that happen." Dahlia, quieter than Boone, asked the question I think actually mattered most. "Why didn't you ever say anything? 9 years, Josie. 9 years of family dinners, holidays, everything. And you just never mentioned it?" I want to be honest with you about my answer, because I think it's the most important thing I said in that entire conversation. Because I never did it to have a claim on anything, I said. I did it because I couldn't watch your dad lose this place, and because he asked me to let him choose when and how to tell you both, in his own way, when he was ready. He didn't get the chance to be ready. I'm sorry that means you're hearing it like this, from me, at a kitchen table, instead of from him, the way he actually wanted. The room held a long, heavy silence. The kind I've learned over 9 years of difficult veterinary conversations with worried, frightened owners means information is actually being absorbed rather than deflected. Boone sat back in his chair. Dahlia looked down at her hands. "So what happens now?" Boone said finally, his voice quieter than it had been all afternoon. "You own a third of this place. Legally. I don't even know what that means for the sale. It means the sale can't happen the way you've structured it," I said. But I want to be really clear about something, because this isn't actually about the money for me. And I think, underneath everything, you both already know that about me, even after everything that's been said today. Your dad didn't want this land developed. He told me that directly, more than once, long before any of this. He wanted it to stay working land, whatever that took. I'm not going to use this deed to take the ranch from either of you. But I'm also not going to sign off on turning it into 400 house lots, because that's not what he asked me to protect it for. I want to tell you honestly that the weeks following that conversation were not simple, and I don't want to pretend they resolved into something clean and easy, because I think the truest version of this story includes the difficulty, not just the eventual outcome. Boone was angry for a period, not at me exactly. I came to understand, but at the situation itself, at a father who'd made a significant decision without telling his own children, at a version of events that didn't fit the Calder blood framework he'd organized his entire relationship to this land around. We had several difficult conversations over those weeks, some of them raw in ways neither of us fully expected. But underneath the anger, I think Boone was also, slowly, working through something harder. A genuine reckoning with the fact that our father had trusted me in a specific, concrete, legally binding way, more than he'd trusted his own biological son, and that the reasons for that trust weren't about bloodline at all. They were about who had actually shown up, consistently, for decades, in exactly the ways that mattered. Dahlia came around faster, in her own quieter way. She visited Jean at the care facility with me, the two of us together for the first time in longer than I could remember, and on that visit, in one of Jean's clearer stretches, he was able to communicate, slowly, in fragments, that he was glad she and I had come together. "Good," he said, the word coming out effortful but clear. Should've told you both. Sorry." Dahlia held his hand and cried, and I think something genuinely shifted in her that afternoon. Something that had less to do with the deed itself and more to do with finally seeing, clearly, how much her father had actually wanted all three of us to be. In his own words later that same visit, struggled out over almost a full minute, one family, not pieces. We didn't sell to the development group. Instead, over the following months, the three of us worked with an agricultural attorney and a land trust organization to place a permanent conservation easement on the majority of the acreage, protecting it from future development regardless of who eventually owns it, while still allowing continued ranching operations. Boone, somewhat to my surprise, ended up moving back to help manage the day-to-day work, discovering, I think, a genuine relationship to this land that had simply never had room to develop, while he'd spent most of his adult life defining his connection to it in terms of inheritance rather than actual labor. Dahlia's family relocated a mile down the road into a smaller house on a parcel we carved off with everyone's full agreement, close enough that her kids are growing up on Calder land the way all three of us once did. Jean is still at the care facility, improving slowly, communicating a little more each month. I visit him most weekends, the way I always have, and Boone and Dahlia visit more now too. Genuinely more. Not out of obligation, but because something about that kitchen table conversation seemed to finally strip away 24 years of quiet, unexamined distance and replace it with something more honest. I want to be clear about something, because I think it's the actual heart of this story. More than the deed, more than the $340,000, more than any of the numbers. I never once needed Boone or Dahlia to call me a Calder. I'd never needed the word, exactly, to know what I actually was to this land and to the man who raised me on it. What I needed, and what I finally got in that difficult kitchen table conversation, was for both of them to finally see, plainly, what had actually been true the whole time. That showing up, year after year, decade after decade, in all the unglamorous, unrecorded ways nobody ever puts on a deed, is its own kind of bloodline, and it counts, whether or not anyone ever thought to check the courthouse records. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever loved a place, or a family, that someone else insisted, confidently, wasn't really yours. Legacy isn't only carried in blood. Sometimes it's carried in who stays, who shows up at 4 a.m. during calving season, who sits in a hospital room holding a hand that can barely squeeze back. The land doesn't actually care whose last name is on the mailbox. It only knows who took care of it. Comment the word bloodline one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. My stepbrother said the ranch wasn't my bloodline. He just never thought to check whose name was already on the land.